Good morning. Welcome to Bellingham Unitarian Fellowship. I'm Reverend Paul Beckel. All who come in the spirit of goodwill are welcome here. We talk a lot about beloved community. Last week, we talked about taking beloved community beyond these walls. But Unitarian Universalism is based upon a covenant among over 1,000 autonomous congregations around the country. So what could beloved community mean in that wider context? Over the centuries, Unitarians and Universalists have been grappling with how to articulate what we commonly believe among us, even while recognizing that however we describe our ideals and aspirations, it will always be imperfect and necessarily in flux. Recently, we've been engaged in a democratic process of possibly articulating who we are in a new way. Today, we're going to look at a bit of history that brought us to this point and where we might go from here.
Good morning. Glad everybody's here. You survived the blizzard last night? Oh, that's why I wore my boots, you know. You know, it's interesting when we stand here or wherever we are, people see something. They see an identity. I have my identity badge, so you know I am Mel Hoover, right? But you know, there's a lot of things we don't see. And it's interesting, Paul doesn't know it, but it's his fault that I brought this today. And some of you may wonder what it is. Anybody know? Yeah, this is a stole. This is a stole with so much rich history. Because many of you may not know, when you see these little notations at the bottom of a hymn, what do they tell you? Tell you something about who wrote it, who's about it. But I have something that helps me know more. I have between the lines. So I can read this on a hymn and get some history and know something about what was going on. So Rank by Rank is an interesting one for me because it is about the history that this Episcopal stole of mine, which is my original ordination, you borrowed and made it one of your core things in terms of Unitarian Universalism. It's part of our living tradition service. It's the time that the ministers come in and new, old, those who are dying, we list them, we honor them. Everybody stands, and our history is kind of walked through the ages. And it's a symbol that we are still alive and well. Once upon a time, this meant for me male privilege, because in the Episcopal Church, we had black churches, unlike the UUs. We had black ministers who were honored and worthy and could be part of our national convention. But in the early years, they couldn't march because we had separation and segregation. But I lived into the time when that began to transition. And I could celebrate that I, now the black male, could walk forward. And it was good and great. And then I went to seminary, and I met these things called women. And these women, one of which I ended up marrying, were my colleagues, took the same courses, did the same interactions, learned the same skills. But in our Episcopal church at that time, I could be ordained, and they could not. So I had a decision point to make, and that was very simple. I was taught to honor all people. I was taught to honor and respect women. I had strong women in my family who were as well or good or better than I. I could not accept my priesting in authenticity. So I had to give up my black male privilege. Because I could not, with integrity and in the spirit of beloved community, which is what I went to seminary to teach and to live, could not accept priesting. I could accept being a deacon. Not to get the deacon order, which is the first order of ministry, whose loyalty is to the people, not to a bishop, not to a God, but to a people. And that bridge was why I thought I could look at Unitarian Universalism, because it called us to look at being people together and finding the fullness of who we were. But guess what? I came into Unitarian Universalism thinking I'd finally found my place, and I remember those early services of the living tradition, and 1, 2, 3, over the years, those were the black ministers who walked through. And I had a point to make. I had a decision point. Do I want to walk through the Unitarian Universalist screen, which did not accept all people, or did not exhibit all of us as part of the ranks that we were honoring? And it's one of those moments when one makes a decision, and that's kind of where we are now. We don't know that what we're doing, we don't know that what we're doing in terms of our articles assessment will give us the ultimate solution, but we do know it's in the right direction. So that's when I said, I'm going to walk through that line so that there are at least 4. And therefore, we are calling us today.
So there would be 4.
There would be 4.
Oh, okay.
I did say there would be 4.
Oh.
And therefore, we are inviting us, UUs, to kind of walk forward in that faith so that the ranks of others who will look back upon us will see all of us on this stage, the fullness of humanity on this stage. And maybe, just maybe, some other people around the world might think that's a good thing for them to do too. So in that spirit, let us give praise and thanks as we light our chalice for all of those who, through the years, oh, thank you. With a child too, that's so wonderful. Generation to generation, that's wonderful. And that's what it's about. And I wear the red because of the sacrifices that we should honor, and for the sacrifices that we can still give, so that the next generation can live their lives in wholeness and fullness. So may it be. Amen.
And please join me in saying our covenant. Love is the spirit of this fellowship, and service gives it life. Celebrating our diversity and joined by a quest for truth, we honor peace and honor all creation. This is our covenant. And therefore, Rank by Rank used to have 3 verses. But in recent years, one of my mentors, Kendall Gibbons, wrote a 4th. So we're going to be singing 3 that are in the hymnal, number 358, and then a 4th, which is printed in your order of service. From that very full and grand and historic image of the ministers marching down in process to be recognized in representing our faith, we have shifted a great deal to also incorporate things that are much more down to earth. I mean, Kendall's, her verse was just a little step in the direction of making things more beyond what Mel was talking about of the white male grandiosity. But I'm going to go even further down to earth now and talk about mice. And I have a story for you littles, since you might identify, down to earth, down with the mice, but I'm guessing some of the other folks will as well. So, there was once upon a time 2 mice. One was named Sniff, and one was named Scurry. And they lived in a world, you might call it a maze, but you might not know what a maze is. A maze is like a puzzle, and to get anywhere, they had to go all around and around to find where they wanted to go. And sometimes there were walls so that they couldn't get through to where they wanted to go. It was a lot of like real life. So, Sniff and Scurry lived at one end of the maze, and every morning they would wake up and think, today we're going to get cheese. And they would start running through the maze. Sniff would use his nose. He would follow his nose until he went through all of the different passages to find the cheese station. And Scurry, he had a different way. He just ran and ran and ran and ran and ran all over. And then he had to go back the other way because that didn't work. And then he had to go back the other way. But he ended up at the cheese station too. And there was a lot of cheese. And they loved it. And they sat around all day and had Colby and blue cheese and camembert and American cheese and Swiss cheese and Gouda and all kinds of other great cheeses. They were just in mouse heaven. They did this day after day, and slowly the pile of cheese started to get a little smaller. So one day, when they ran through the maze, because after they had eaten for the day and were all stuffed, they went back home. And then they'd wake up again, and they'd run through the maze, and one day there wasn't any cheese left. And Sniff said, "Who moved my cheese? That's not fair. Oh, I am really angry." And Scurry said, seems like the cheese is gone. I think I'll go find some more. And he scurried and scurried and scurried and scurried. And Sniff was over here sniffing. Who moved my cheese? And Scurry found some cheese, had a nice little breakfast, and scurried on back and said, "Sniff, Sniff, there's more cheese somewhere. I found a little bit. I bet if we keep looking, we'll find a lot." And Sniff said, "I don't know. It seems like I can smell it right here." And Scurry said, "I think that's just the leftover grease on the floor and the wall. There's not really, I mean, look around. Look, use your eyes in addition to your nose. There's no cheese here." And Sniff said, "Well, that's not fair." And Scurry said, "But if you're hungry, you better come with me." Sniff said, "But I'm afraid." And Scurry said, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And Sniff said, "Oh, my goodness, I'll show you what I would do if I wasn't afraid." And he started sniffing and sniffing and sniffing and followed a path, and he too got to the cheese station. And he loved it. He found new kinds of cheese and lots of kinds of cheese. And then one day that ran out too. And Sniff got all sniffly again, and Scurry said to him, "I think we can still find new cheese if we look." And Sniff said, "Oh, but I already know what kinds of cheeses there are. I don't need to go looking for new cheeses." Nobody got that one. I don't need a new cheese. Never mind. That was just a sidelight. That was just, I introduced that. Could have introduced that better. So Scurry said to him, "Maybe if you use your imagination will help you find the new cheese." And Sniff thought, I'm going to use my imagination. What would it look like, the best cheese? What would it smell like? What would it taste like? What would it feel like in the mouth? And he used his imagination and all of his senses, and he went around, and guess what he found? More cheese. And the story goes on, because Sniff and Scurry are still sniffing and scurrying around because they still love cheese and they still need to go to new places to find it, but now they have each other to encourage them on. So that's the end of that story, and we're going to sing you off to your classrooms. Thought about that joke. I set it up. The very first time I told that I was moving to Wisconsin. I had been in a church in Ohio, and nobody had ever met me yet. Well, the people who invited me had met me. But for the most part, people hadn't. And I ran up on stage that Sunday morning, and I said, "Oh, I'm so glad to be here in the land of Jesus." And those Unitarians looked at me and, what have we got here? Oh, and it was back then. That was some time ago when I had little kids myself, and he must have been in first or second grade when our son Rick came home from school. It was about the time of Thanksgiving, asking, "I know there's still Indians around, but whatever happened to the Puritans?" The Pilgrims. Whatever happened to the Pilgrims? And like much of the history of early European settlers in North America, stories and images of the various groups of people have been blended and confused. I just got confused again there. Pilgrims versus Puritans, any number of immigrants might be considered religious pilgrims. But the stereotypical image we usually conjure up is that of the Puritans, who were not the first, but began arriving in Massachusetts Bay around 1630. And it's with the Puritans that we'll start our whirlwind tour of a slice of Unitarian and Universalist quest for identity, or at least that fraction of Unitarians and Universalists which today have become the Unitarian Universalist Association, of which we are a part. Yes, what we now call our liberal religious heritage is an offshoot of what was in many ways, but not all, an extraordinarily conservative community. The term Puritan might be applied to any number of groups revolting during the Christian Reformation in Europe, claiming to represent the true essence of Jesus' message. And there already we have a vital element of the liberal spirit that we've inherited: dissent, the determination to stand up to traditional authority, not without risk and not just for the heck of it, but because conscience demands that we follow the truth of a higher authority. But to get to my son's question, what we most typically think of as Puritans in this country are those groups that arrived in Massachusetts Bay in relatively small numbers compared to the vast numbers of other immigrants coming for so many different reasons. There were maybe 20,000 Puritans that arrived just in the first 10 years. And then they gradually splintered off into other entities or denominations and were pretty much gone within 100 years. But not before they had time, just within the first few years they were here, to establish Harvard College, because they were very much into education and literacy. They were extremely literate people because theoretically they said, we want each person to be able to interpret the Bible for themselves. And they were still around long enough to execute a whole lot of witches. Because although the Puritans stood for religious toleration, that was only for themselves. But the key to what gradually emerged among the ancestors, who we are now more proud to claim, is their congregationalism, which was their way of replacing authoritarian hierarchy. Instead, they turned to themselves, their own community, and placed authority in a covenant, the promises that they made among themselves. They would choose for themselves their leaders and their standards of membership. Then they eventually extended themselves in 1648 into what became the Cambridge Platform, a group of congregations that adopted a covenant through which they identified themselves as a community of autonomous churches, which you might think a contradiction in terms. How can something be a community but autonomous, connected and to some degree identified with a larger group, but autonomous, making their own decisions? Well, we've been trying to figure that out ever since. It was not such a contradiction, though, that it couldn't survive, as congregationalism is still a form of governance used today by Baptists and Quakers and Mennonites and Jews and the United Churches of Christ. And of course, the 1,000 plus autonomous congregations that make up the Unitarian Universalist Association, whose statement of collective identity today begins with the words, "We the congregations of the Unitarian Universalist Association covenant to affirm and promote these principles." So today's version is a cobbled together, the one that starts the way I just said, is a cobbled together from a democratic process in the 1980s, but I'm getting way ahead of myself. Through the Cambridge Platform, these early congregations, desiring to act for the common good, covenanted to offer to one another care, consultation, admonition. That was a real tricky one. Admonition from one congregation to another of you're doing it wrong. That really became complicated. But they felt that was a way that they could support one another in the terms of their existence and who they thought they were. Care, consultation, admonition, participation, recommendation, and relief. Pretty simple until you try to define what each of these mean. Over the next several decades, through much compromise, this covenant was adapted and refined in an attempt to remain relevant in a rapidly changing world. After a couple hundred years of this, by the early 1800s, their autonomy, unsurprisingly, had enabled different congregations to take on different priorities. While some continued to focus on doctrinal purity, others started prioritizing the development of ethical character, and rather than worshiping Jesus, putting his teachings into practice. To be specific, the liberals drifted from doctrinal purity by rejecting the doctrines of original sin and predestination, which was a belief that God chose people even before they were born to either be saved or to go the other way, which was where most of us would go. Those who dissented from those doctrines, dissenting from the dissenters, they thought that this doctrine of predestination denied the possibility of a moral life. Because how could you be moral if you had no free will to choose whether or not to behave ethically or unethically? Certainly, we had to have free will to decide between right and wrong. So by the mid-1700s, one dissenter among those dissenters went so far as to call for the rejection of all creeds, to be replaced instead by private judgment and conscience as the highest authority, really pushing the boundaries. After several more decades of this polarization, because there were still the original Orthodox Calvinist Christians and then these liberals that were kind of going off in a variety of directions, the traditionalists, the Trinitarians, started denigrating the others who had no real particular identity. They started to call them Unitarians because they really weren't supporting the divine status of Jesus as one of the highest values. So then in the early 1800s, the liberals decided to claim that name proudly. Yes, we will be the Unitarians. That's who we are. And then they started arguing amongst themselves what that would mean and who would be included. So then the 1830s, we're going to be moving real quickly through this, brought Unitarian Reverend Ralph Waldo Emerson, whose minister father had been amongst the earlier radicals. The younger Emerson advocated for an even further, going even further from the tradition to a really American individualism, real strong emphasis on individualism, to the point that he decided to abandon the ministry altogether and become an independent lecturer. But he still had proteges around, and they started preaching about how all Christian doctrines are just changeable human artifacts. Even Jesus' miracles, even Scripture itself was transient. Now that, thought his peers, that was taking it too far. So Theodore Parker, who is the one who preached the transient and the permanent in Christianity, was asked to leave. His peers in the Boston Ministers Association asked Parker to leave because they were getting a lot of pressure of saying, you Unitarians, you're going a bit far. So they asked him to leave, but when he refused, they couldn't think of any good reason to actually expel him. They didn't want to actually have such precise rules that would expel him. But at least they could ostracize him, and they really did for the rest of his life. And I'm sure it didn't help that he was fierce advocate, anti-slavery advocate, and a supporter of the women's movement, such to the point where he even addressed God as the mother and father of us all. Then not too long thereafter, in the wake of the American Civil War, Reverend Henry Bellows, who had been the leader of the U.S. Sanitary Commission, their efforts to upgrade medical treatment for the wounded and various public health efforts and public works, he wanted to capitalize on what he had learned about bringing people together in the spirit of the times after the war, of people coming together to take on the larger undertaking of bringing Unitarians together into the National Conference of Unitarian Churches. Now, by this time, the Unitarian churches had spread way to the west, which they called the West, which we now call the Midwest, but somewhat beyond that. And the further and further they went geographically from those stodgy old Unitarians in the East, those moving west fiercely objected to the idea of a national organization. They thought it would start to require of them a creed, a statement of common belief, and a uniformity of thought, which they could not tolerate. The evidence was clear. Those in the East who published the annual yearbook listing the ministers had excluded one of those who refused to call himself a Christian. He was no longer included in the Unitarian yearbook. So we Westerners did not want to be a part of that. Instead, the Westerners turned to new sources of authority, reason and science, and eventually the insights of Darwin's theory of evolution, which posed a real threat to traditional views of a divine creator. So, rejecting the idea of a formal organization, those dissenters of the dissenters of the dissenters decided to form their own organization, the Free Religious Association, which, since they didn't want an organization, unsurprisingly didn't last very long. It too split into two camps, one being oriented toward the science, and one hanging on to Emerson and Parker's approach to religion, which was more around intuition and feeling. Separation and reunion, separation and reunion, separation and reunion. It goes on and on. And eventually, on the cusp of a new century, these groups, and even the old guard back east, finally came together with a statement called "The Things Most Commonly Believed Today Among Us." That's as close as they could get. The things most commonly believed today among us. It was an awkward title, but it had some beautiful language. More important, perhaps, it was not centered on theology, but was more of a mashup of theology and ethics. It read in part, "We believe that to love the good and live the good is the supreme thing in religion. We hold reason and conscience to be final authorities." See how clever they took the reason and conscience to be final authorities in matters of religious belief. "We honor the Bible and all inspiring scriptures, old and new. We revere Jesus and all holy souls that have taught men truth and righteousness and love. We believe that good and evil inevitably carry their own recompense, no good thing being failure and no evil thing being success. We believe that we ought to join hands and work to make the good things better and the worst things good, counting nothing good for self that is not good for all." So that was like 1894, 97, just before the beginning of the 20th century. And that statement of unity closed with a lofty ode to the unfolding universe, with reference to God, but in a way that left interpretation open to naturalistic interpretations, or even God as an abstraction of human ideals like love. This reunion and reconciliation, this compromise of language for a higher purpose than language could attain, enabled them collectively to move past rhetorical debates to address social challenges which were much more pressing and at the core of what they were all committed to. So one thing that made that possible, no doubt, is that they had language in a preamble to that statement of the things commonly believed among us, and that was accepted unanimously and remains today as an essential aspect of our self-descriptions. It said, "Nothing in this Constitution is to be construed as an authoritative test. And we cordially invite to our working fellowship any who, differing from us in belief, are in general sympathy with our spirit and our practical aims. So where were the Universalists in all of this? Well, they had gotten started a little bit later, gathering for the first time in the late 1700s, with a distinctly doctrinal basis that all people would, by the grace of a loving God, be saved in the afterlife. But then the Universalists, too, evolved over the 1800s, such that they began to shift from an emphasis on everyone being saved in the afterlife to a focus on the universal kinship of all people and a focus on serving all people here and now on earth. In 1917, the Universalists came together around what they called a Declaration of Moral Principles, stressing that, and this is a really important part of our heritage, which has definitely carried on, stressing that evil is the result of, this is something that we're not allowed to talk about in Florida. Evil is the result of, quote, unjust social and economic conditions. By this time, the traditional Christians were starting to feel threatened by the growing trend toward secularization and the acceptance of science as a higher authority than religion. This was the dawn of Christian fundamentalism, when Universalist minister L.B. Fisher was accused of believing in nothing at all. Fisher replied, "Universalists are often asked to tell where they stand. The only true answer to give to this question is that we do not stand, we move. We grow and we march as all living things forever must do." And now, having spent way too much time getting to this point, I must move on and skip through an entire century with just a couple of highlights. The Unitarians and the Universalists had been recognized for what they had been recognizing. They knew of each other and started to begin to know that they had a lot in common for probably a century before they actually started talking about merger in the 1950s. Of course, given the different trajectories I've just described, it was not simple to bring them together into perfect alignment. After all, the Unitarians arose from the Harvard-educated establishment, and even into the mid-1800s, the Unitarians were supported by taxes in Massachusetts, including taxes paid by the Universalists, who still struggled for the right to exist. So during merger talks, for example, questions arose such as, should congregations have the right to determine who is eligible for membership? Well, of course, you might think. But concerns were raised, not surprisingly, as this was the era of mass movements for racial equality. Concerns were raised that if we allow congregations to determine their own criteria for membership, then congregations could exclude people based on race or other arbitrary standards. What a quandary. Should the laudable goal of inclusiveness be imposed upon congregations against their will? In the end, though, after all the debates about governance, it came down to wordsmithing the theology. Through several versions of a statement about how we understood our relationship to Christianity, finally it was down to just a few words. The second to the last proposal presented by the Universalists included a reference to our Judeo-Christian heritage. The Unitarians would have nothing of it. But consensus was finally reached when the Unitarians reluctantly agreed to acknowledge the Judeo-Christian heritage. Not ours, but the. The world continued to change, our focus continued to change. Our current expression of 7 principles and 5 sources from which to draw inspiration came to be in the 1980s through another series of conversations among congregational delegates. And since then, the most significant shift was the addition of a 6th source in the 1990s. Depending upon which edition of the gray hymnal you have in front of you, the 6th source may not even be listed. And I think we have a poster out front, a very nice, fine-looking poster of calligraphy that only goes through the 80s and doesn't include the 6th source, which says, spiritual teachings of earth-centered traditions, which celebrate the sacred circle of life and instruct us to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. That was not easily accepted. It was initiated from the ground up through the feminist movement and was hotly debated at the time. We were letting in witches and a whole new pantheon of pagan gods. And yet, in my opinion, this source supporting the principle, affirming our respect for an interdependent web of all existence, became the key to our identity and our unity, at least for the next 20 years.
You know, Paul, your story about the cheese reminded me of a recent news article I read that the Kraft company is going to open a cheese factory in Israel, and they're going to call it Cheeses of Nazareth.
Seriously?
Well, just had to say that. I hope you've looked at the cover of today's order of service, those words there, in a house which becomes a home, one hands down and another takes up the heritage of mind and heart, laughter and tears, music and musings and deeds. Love, like a carefully loaded ship, crosses the gulf between the generations. These few words could apply to parents and our offspring needing to have love to bridge the generation gap. But as Paul was pointing out in his brief history, it also applies to our faith with its living tradition and what we need to do today to generate what we and future generations will aspire to. And Paul did share what we have inherited from previous generations, from the American Unitarian Association that formed in 1821, and the Universalist Church of America, the first Universalist church formed in 1774. So our 2 separate faith systems developed during the same time as our country was developing, and we both initially drew from roots on the other side of the Atlantic. The proposed Article 2 revision of our purpose, as called for in the UUA bylaws, happens to be the only exciting part of our otherwise boring bylaws, because that's what bylaws are. But actually, I am grateful that we have the bylaws as a container for how to have a process for reviewing who we are and how we run things, such as our GA and our board meetings and all that. It's all necessary to keep us legal, but faith, our inner lives, our chosen religion, personally and corporately, examining who we are, claiming who we want to be. How do we want to be in a nation and a world experiencing climate change and rising fascism? All that is anything but boring. In a few minutes, Lou Finney is going to talk about the next steps in the process for considering and possibly adopting the new Article 2 for this congregation and the UUA. What I found in thinking about it is that in addition to these external processes, there's our own internal process for considering the proposed changes. I remember coming into Unitarian Universalism when Mel and I officially transferred our original ordinations to the UUA, his Episcopal, as he said, and mine, American Baptist. Well, while we were engaged in that process of becoming UUs, the UUA was engaged in the study to adopt what became our current principles. We had joined the first Unitarian Universalist Society of Stamford, Connecticut. This was my first experience of a church calling itself a society, which surprised me, and I think that was a term from our Universalist heritage. But in Stamford, society in the name was more welcoming for the fairly significant number of Jewish members. So from that early experience with UUism, I was impressed with the inclusiveness implied. I have very happy memories about the adoption of our principles at GA 1984 in Columbus, Ohio. It really was momentous. As a feminist, I felt my being was affirmed as we replaced the 6 purposes from the '61 merger. Thanks to UU women organizing and raising our voices, the male-only language of the original purposes was left behind. I also remember feeling that after all the congregational studies and discussions, there were still only 6 new principles and something more was needed. The motion from the floor of GA to add the 7th principle and to bring in our interconnectedness to the web of life met that need. There was joy when all 7 principles were affirmed. It was a solidifying moment for Unitarian Universalism and also for me personally. I felt like I now had a way to talk about this old faith that was still new to me. I've always focused on the joy of the new creation of the 1984 principles, not even really thinking about the grief or apprehension for those living through the changes of their beloved faith becoming something new. In our current process of updating Article 2, I've had time to absorb the proposed updating of our current principles, of making the purpose of UUism more inclusive and clearer for the next generation. I'm impressed with the Article 2 Commission's latest draft, especially after participating in the Retired Ministers Group, where we were very critical. I believe the Commission took feedback seriously, not just ours, but everyone's, in discussions across the country. But there's still something nagging me. In our previous congregation, we had a member who is an artist. He did an artistic rendition of each principle with his symbolic interpretation circling a shortened version of the words. And then his principles, his interpretation surrounded us along the walls of our sanctuary. I liked the yellow background for encouragement to spiritual growth and the green background of search for truth and meaning. That one hung in the middle, right above the pulpit. Occasionally, I would wonder, what kind of symbolism would it be if truth fell off in the middle of a sermon and whacked me on the head? I ask myself and all of you, what is it like to consider a new iteration of our principles? And do we really need to? I, who usually talk about embracing change, am surprised at myself. Even when I tell myself this is a wonderful opportunity to deepen understandings of UUism, there's still a little voice in the back of my mind that asks, can't we leave well enough alone? I think of Buddhism with its 8-fold path that's been around for over 2,000 years. Follow it in order to end suffering. Can't our 7 principles be as durable as an 8-fold path? Well, apparently not. And we can't leave well enough alone if it's not well enough. We are asking ourselves, what do we want to generate for ourselves and the next generations of Unitarian Universalists? What to pass on, what to change, and what to let go of. If you are wondering why and why now, There are actually some good reasons. Back in 1961, delegates to General Assembly included in the bylaws that every 15 to 20 years, we UUs should have a review of Article 2, especially if there are other reasons besides the passage of time. This time around, we've got both. Few people seem now to remember that we UUs went through an Article 2 review process about 20 years ago. At that time, GA delegates voted to let the principles and purposes continue as written. The passage of time did not call for change. Perhaps those back in '61 who called for a regular review of Article 2 were channeling the spirit of our historic Unitarian ancestor, Thomas Jefferson. To keep the ideals and revolutionary spirit of our young nation alive, Jefferson didn't think our Constitution should be etched in stone, but every 20 years a new generation should have the right to choose for itself the form of government that would promote their own happiness. The current members of the Article 2 Commission don't think our principles and purposes should be etched in stone either. They say, consider them written in pencil. Besides the passage of time, other events point to the need for changes to Article 2. We had the 2017 explosion of our UUA hiring practices, which led to the resignation of our UUA president, the appointment of a 3-person presidential team, and the opportunity to look at ourselves through widening the circle. We've also had a group organizing around a proposal to change the first principle from respect to the inherent worth and dignity of all persons to respect for the inherent worth and dignity of all beings. And most recently, as we've all been involved here, we've had the call for adding an 8th principle, calling us to create beloved community in our congregations and beyond. Well, as Jim Reimer said when we were preparing for this service, if we keep what we have, how many more principles are we going to add or change? The revised Article 2 reflects back to us that we as a faith community have moved from emphasis on the independent individual to emphasis on being in community, where all are equal and welcome. Over the years, we have worked on hearing the truths of women's lives and the truths of the lives of people of color. We have expanded from the we of primarily white male and female to include all genders and peoples of color. We have been on an incredible culture-expanding journey. The enduring values of Unitarian Universalism continue in the proposed Article 2 in ways that speak to the times in which we live, and we hope for a couple of more decades until a new commission takes up a review. This commission envisions our values as a flower with love at the center, challenging us to be accountable to one another for living our shared values through the spiritual discipline of love. Around the centering value of love are 6 inseparable values arranged as petals, and those 6 are interdependence, pluralism, justice, transformation, generosity, and equity. And in the proposal, each value is followed by covenant and action statements that really incorporate our former principles or our current principles into them. And now I'm only going to read the last sentence of the new purpose statement and urge you to read the whole statement when you're studying this yourself. The proposed closing sentence of the purpose reads, "The purpose of the Unitarian Universalist Association is to actively engage its members in the transformation of the world through liberating love." We don't know what the future holds, but I believe that what the world needs now is love, liberating love. That's the kind that we just need more of. Whatever happens in the process, this proposed Article 2 is a gift because it asks us, Why does Unitarian Universalism exist? I think of our Unitarian and Universalist heritages. Since our nation's inception, as people of faith, we have helped keep alive the vision of inclusive democracy. I am greatly concerned that our country is at a tipping point over the choice to have an inclusive democracy or to have more laws and policies favoring white primacy, where people of non-white cultures end up dehumanized and history gets distorted. The best, most hopeful expression I can think of for inclusive democracy is beloved community. Working with everyone who wishes to create beloved community in a nation that needs to know it is possible is a great reason to exist. The purpose of transforming the world through liberating love has unlimited expressions. It can be as simple as listening to your neighbor when they're hurting, or comforting a child, tending a flower, or realizing the beauty of life and laughing with friends. It can also be as complex as working to end homelessness and working to create equity in the greater community. It's up to each of us to express our unique interpretation of liberating love and to know that being in beloved community means we are not alone. Our love-based faith can be a guiding star for our lives. Before we hear from Lou, we are going to join in singing hymn number 297, The Star of Truth. This hymn reminds us that where the hearts of all are free, a truer faith we there shall find. So I'm going to invite you to listen to the melody as it is played through once, because if you read music, it's not going to sound like what you see. We are singing the words of number 297 to the melody of hymn number 34.
I share Rose's consternation when the controversy came up that led us to the process of replacing our 7 principles. That kind of harkened back to, somebody moved my cheese. Rank by rank, again we stand, from the 4 winds gathered hither. I was thinking, yes, we're gathered from the 4 winds, but we do stand rank by rank, overcoming a wide variety of our differences. And it brings to mind something like, how can we at Buff stand rank by rank with a congregation, a huge congregation in suburban Boston, and the tiny congregation in rural Montana? Somehow we've done that. Somehow we've done that with what we know now as our second article. So how do we find common ground? And will that common ground, as we look again at updating Article 2 of our association bylaws, a lot of discussion, probably a lot of compromise, and some more discussion, and some more compromise, and that's a little bit of what I plan to talk about. But the first thing in that extended process that we need to look at is how we begin the discussion here in our congregation. A draft has been proposed, and Rose talked about how that was put together. But the question is it a good, valid statement suitable for Article 2, a basic fundamental article in our bylaws? Then we have to ask, how might we change what's been proposed? How would you change it? And I invite you, all of you, to join in that conversation. Today, if you have questions, certainly for Rose or for me, and I guess we're going to get Paul involved after the service downstairs.
Rose and Mel will be on Zoom,
Okay,
and you and Stephanie downstairs.
yeah, we'll get there. Our intent is to answer any questions you might have at this point. There may be many. More important, though, next week, come to the Buff Potluck Sunday dinner after church for a more extensive consideration of the proposals to change Article 2. And yes, there will be a Zoom connection, so those of you who are involved in Zoom will have an opportunity to participate in that. Will there be more discussion between now and the General Assembly, at which all the delegates will have an opportunity to vote? Yes, inevitably. We may do a substantial redraft, we may amend it, and then we're going to have to vote. Our delegates to General Assembly will vote. If you're interested and have the time to be a delegate, please talk to me. I've been through that process many times, and I'd be glad to address it with you. If you choose to be a delegate, no, you won't have to travel to Pittsburgh, where the General Assembly is going on. They do a wonderful job of doing it virtually. That technology is well advanced. But to be a delegate, get your name in the hat. The Buff board will make the appointments of who are delegates. Across the association, expect changes to be proposed. Based on the discussion, we may have changes to propose. Those changes will be discussed at the business sessions at General Assembly. Some of them inevitably will make the cut, be accepted. Others will be rejected. And in each case, a vote will be taken during those business sessions, accept this proposed change or not. And there is a period of time coming up starting in April at which congregations can submit proposed changes. Many details on that are yet to be determined. The next thing is we have the opportunity to instruct our delegates to General Assembly. Do we tell them, accept it, it's great, we love it? Or, no, we don't like it, reject it. What I would hope we can come to is that we can tell our delegates to look at all of the changes that have been made, and there will be changes made. Use your best good judgment on whether to vote to adopt it or to say no. And with that vote, which will conclude on the last day of General Assembly, it's not over. As Rose described a little bit, when the Unitarians and the Universalists got together, actually became one association in 1961, there were many compromises. But one of the areas on which there was significant agreement was that there are certain key areas that we need to be sure that we get it right. Article 2 was one of them. They laid out the procedures so that on the first consideration of a major change in Article 2, we can amend it, we can update it, but it must be examined again at a subsequent General Assembly. So, whatever this year's GA comes up with, when we're done with it and vote on it, if we accept it, it will still be a draft. And in June of 2024, that General Assembly will make the final decision. They don't get to make any more changes, but they do get to either accept or reject the draft that's been proposed. Again, the process is hard and long, but they want to get it right. So, we've reached that point in our service when it's time for us to contribute to the ongoing work that sustains Buff. And it's worth noting that a small portion of our contributions to Buff are forwarded to support the work of our national association. The ushers will pass the baskets here in the sanctuary. Those of you on Zoom should very shortly be seeing a page that tells you how to make a contribution in other ways.
for your generosity. Know too that you can contribute to Buff by purchasing the Ginny Baker has original watercolors out there in the narthex, and they're going to be coming down next week to be replaced by a new art exhibit, so take a look at those, and a portion of the proceeds from those sales will go to Buff. And one last thing on fundraising, I'd like to have Vlad come up and tell you about what's coming next.
Without my cape, I've got to say. And I'll make this brief. I'm Rick Steele with representing stewardship team, and we're just getting ready to kick off the campaign. We're kicking it off today as far as pledge drive, canvassing, and we're returning as much as you are comfortable with to person-on-person canvassing. But I'd like to have the canvassers that are here today stand up so you can see who's dedicating themselves to reaching out to you. And I just want to offer up a blessing to you all and for the deepening of connection in our community. Those of you on Zoom, you may be thinking that how is this going to work? Everybody's going to have options, and we want everybody to be comfortable with that process. So you will be receiving shortly, it's in the mail, a letter telling you of your different options, and then you'll also be able to connect with your canvasser as far as ironing that out, how that's going to work for you. So thank you.
And it's going to be fun. We're going to have so much fun talking about money and Buff and awesomeness. It's going to be a really good time. So we're looking forward to seeing you folks again.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Our next hymn is Jazz Alleluia, and I will be assisted, I guess, by Patricia and by Jane, because this is a round. So I will be leading the first part of the round with the people here on your right. Patricia will be leading the center group, and Jane will be leading the group on your left. We'll be singing the song first all together, and then I will step down and we'll start singing the round twice through. We should be really rocking it by the second time. I'm really looking forward to this one, so stand as you are able, please, and we'll sing Jazz Alleluia.
Let's conclude with a responsive reading for our benediction. Number 646. We clasp the hands of those that go before us, and the hands of those who come after us. We enter the little circle of each other's arms, and the larger circle of lovers, whose hands are joined in a dance, and the larger circle of all creatures, passing in and out of life, who move also in a dance, to a music so subtle and vast that no one hears it except in fragments. And let's finish up with Circle Round for Freedom.